Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Casey, and if this is your first time here, well, guess what? It's my first time too, because this is my first episode on my YouTube channel. I'm the designer behind the indie sewing pattern company, Pattern Scout. I love to sew and I love to teach, and I would love to teach you how to sew. That is why I started this channel. So let's get right into it. Today is part sew along, part pattern hack of a very beginner friendly dress pattern. And this is actually a dress pattern that I sell in my shop at patternscoutstudio.com. And I'll put a link in the description below so that you can go get that pattern if you'd like. I was inspired for this project by a very pretty summery linen dress that I saw on Pinterest. And it just looked like a very versatile style that could be worn kind of dressy or kind of more casual. And I knew that the Hannah Tankin dress pattern would be perfect for this pattern hack. I made a couple of really easy modifications to the pattern to transform it into the style that I wanted. So the inspiration dress was a maxi length dress, and I had originally planned to also make mine a maxi length dress, but somewhere along the way, it turned into a midi length dress. So I just kind of rolled with it, but I actually really liked the way it turned out. So it ended up working out just fine. Be sure to check out the description below for links and additional resources to go along with this tutorial. Okay, let's talk about supplies. You're going to need fabric, interfacing, a tape measure, some cutting tools like a rotary cutter or fabric scissors, pins, a seam ripper, some sort of marking tool like a Choco liner, and optional but definitely helpful are thread snips, a seam gauge, a buttonhole chisel, a bias tape maker, and additional rulers or straight edges you have laying around. And for this project, I'll be using the Hannah Tankin dress pattern, which I've linked in the description below. My fabric is a really lightweight tissue linen blend that I picked up at Joann Fabrics. First, we need to cut our fabric. I have the front bodice here that has a built-in placket, and we're going to cut 2 of those mirrored. We're also going to cut a back bodice on the fold, and this pattern is really simple. It just has 2 pattern pieces. So first I'm going to cut the back bodice, and what I like to do is trace around my pattern piece, trace the shape onto the fabric before I cut, just to make sure everything fits nicely before I cut it. And I'm adding 15 inches to the length on both the front and the back bodice of this pattern to make it longer because I want it to be a midi length. And here you can see this is where the original pattern stopped, and I just added that 15 inches there. I started by cutting the back bodice first, and my rotary blade is very dull. I need a new one. And I eventually decided I had to just switch to scissors. Now I've got the back bodice complete and I can move on to the front. And I've repositioned my fabric, and again I'm adding 15 inches to the bottom of this dress, and I will do the same thing for the front that I did for the back. For the bust dart, I like to cut out the pattern where the bust dart is and then trace it, but then I draft a new side seam on the exterior of the dart because I'm not actually going to cut the dart triangle. I'm just going to fold it there. And I've cut 2 of these pieces mirrored for both sides of the front bodice. For now, we can set the bodice aside. Next up, we're going to make bias tape. And to do this, you're going to want to fold your fabric on the bias, so at a 45-degree angle, and then we're just going to cut strips of fabric on the bias so that we have some nice, long, and kind of stretchy strips that we can use to bind the armhole and neckline of our dress. And right now I'm just finishing making my bias with my bias tape maker. And you can also buy bias tape if you don't feel like making it. You just want to get a 1/2 inch bias tape that is single fold for this project. Now we're going to grab our bodice pieces again, and we're going to stay stitch around the armhole and the neckline of both the front and the back bodice. Stay stitching will prevent these areas from stretching out while we construct the rest of the garment. And to stay stitch, I'm just using a regular stitch length, and I'm stitching just inside the seam allowance on all of those curved surfaces. And my stay stitching got a little bit puckered here, so I just reduced my tension and kept going. Once your stay stitching is complete for both the front and the back bodice, we can move on to sewing the bust darts. And I like to match up the dart legs at the side seam and put a pin, and then I just fold the dart and use the line that I drew as a reference for sewing the dart, and I like to also press it in place. So I'm starting at the side seam and sewing all the way past the point of the dart, and I leave my thread tails long and tie those in a double knot just to secure the end of that and prevent it from coming undone. I like to do this instead of a back stitch. I think it's a little bit neater. And then I trim my threads, and then I'm just gonna press the darts downward on both the front and the back of the bodice. Next, we are going to interface the button plackets along the front bodice, and I'm just using a super lightweight fusible interfacing for this. We're just going to cut 2 strips of 1-inch wide interfacing, and that'll be 1 strip for each button placket on the front bodice. When choosing interfacing, you just want to choose something that's appropriate for the weight of fabric you're using. So I'm using a really lightweight fabric and a really lightweight interfacing. Now I'm just going to align my interfacing strip on the wrong side of the fabric with the button placket, and I'm placing that 3/8 inch away from the edge. I'm using my iron here to gently tap down the interfacing to adhere it before I flip it over and iron it really well on the other side, and that'll keep it from sticking to my iron. Next, we're going to prep the button placket by folding it toward the wrong side, first by 3/8 inch and then by 1 inch, and that'll conceal our interfacing in the placket. Once again, I'm trying to avoid placing the iron directly on the interfacing strip because I don't want it to stick to the iron. And I'm just folding that really neatly all the way down the front of the dress. You'll do this for both of the front bodice pieces. And when you're finished, the top should fold really nice and neatly in a line with the neckline here. Next, at the top of the button placket, right here at the neckline, I'm just gonna fold this placket back on itself in the wrong direction by 1 inch and pin that in place. And I'll base that down to keep it in place. Later, we're going to fold the placket to the right side and it'll nicely conceal the bias binding, but for now we're just going to leave it turned to the wrong side. Next, we're going to join the front and the back bodice pieces, and I'm just going to pin all the way around the garment to get those positioned in place before I sew them. At the bottom edge of the dress, I'm going to leave a slit in the side seam. I measured it at 15 inches here, but I actually extended it to 20 inches. And I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. Now I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine and sew it up. I'm starting at the slit opening just to make sure that I don't sew past it when I'm getting lost in my sewing. And then I'm sewing the shoulder seam. I'm going to do the same thing for the opposite side, starting at the slit and sewing up to the armhole and the shoulder seam. Now I'm going to take this over to my serger and finish just the shoulder seams with a serged edge to keep them from fraying. If you don't have a serger, you could do a zigzag stitch or something fancier like a French seam or flat felled seam. Next, to finish the slit opening, I've just done a narrow hem fold and pressed it along that opening edge and extended the fold about 2 inches above the slit opening. Now I'm just going to clip into that right up to the seam allowance without clipping through it and fold the top of that fold down to provide a nice, neat seam finish on the interior. Starting at the bottom of the skirt, I'm going to top stitch that folded slit edge all the way around. When I get to the top of that slit edge, I'm just going to stop and pivot around that triangular fold that I pressed in the last step. And I'm going to continue down the opposite side, and I will do this for both slits on either side. Next, I'm going to sew a little tacking stitch across the top of the slit to reinforce that area and keep it from pulling open. And I need to trim these little strands. With the slit finished, I'm just going to take this back over to the serger and serge along the entire side seam down to the slit to finish that edge and again keep it from fraying. Like before, if you wanted to use a zigzag stitch to do this, that's fine, or you could use something fancier like a flat felled seam. Next, we can move on to attaching the bias binding to the neckline and the armholes. I'm starting with the neckline, and I'm just pinning it at the neckline on top of the placket that is folded in the wrong direction, if that makes sense. I don't like to pin my bias binding to the entire edge that I'm going to be binding. I like to kind of do this as I go along on the sewing machine. I find this is a little bit easier and kind of keeps things from getting bound up. And I've just continued that all the way to the other placket edge. And as you can see, it overlaps that placket edge. Now we're going to do the armhole, and I have pinned it right at the side seam on the bottom of the armhole. And again, same technique, I'm just kind of placing it as I go, and I'm making sure that I'm pressing all of my seams toward the back bodice. When I reach the bottom of the armhole again, I'm going to fold that first edge back by about 1/2 inch and overlap the other end on top of it. I'm going to trim that end. And now you can see that when we fold this up, it's going to be nicely concealed. Once I have all of the bias binding attached, I'm just going to press it first away from the bodice, and then I'm going to press it again to the wrong side of the bodice. And here I'm doing an armhole. I have a tailor's ham that I'm using. It makes it a little bit easier to press around curved surfaces like an armhole, but you can do this without it just fine too. So I'll continue that process for both armholes and the neckline. I've also turned the button placket right side out now, and I'm going to just top stitch that down along the entire front of the bodice. And now my bias binding edge is nicely concealed in the button placket. I've done that for both button plackets. Now I can finish the neckline bias binding by top stitching it from the wrong side all the way around the neckline, starting at one button placket and working my way around to the other, which gives me a really nice, neat, finished edge for my binding. Next, I will continue top stitching the bias binding around each armhole. And you can pat yourself on the back because we just finished the most difficult part of this project. I'm also planning a more in-depth bias binding tutorial, so be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss that. Next up is hemming, which means that we are so close to the end of this project. I am just turning up the bottom edge of the dress by 1 inch 2 times and pressing that. You may have to go through and trim some of the loose threads that have popped out while you've been roughing up this dress to get it constructed. Then we're just going to top stitch down the hem with a straight stitch. And you're going to do that for all 3 hem edges. Now we are ready to install the buttons and buttonholes. And typically in women's apparel, the right goes over the left when worn. So we're going to put buttonholes on the right placket. And to do this, I've just aligned this with my gridded cutting mat, and I'm placing a pin every 3 inches where I want a buttonhole. Next, I'll go over to the sewing machine and switch to a buttonhole foot. And each sewing machine is a little bit different the way that they sew buttonholes, but I'm switching to a buttonhole stitch, and I'm centering the opening for my buttonhole on each pin to place the buttonholes, and of course removing the pins as I go. If you're unsure how to do a buttonhole on your sewing machine, be sure to check your owner's manual. Those are actually really helpful. I've laid the garment flat with both plackets aligned side by side, and I'm using the buttonholes as a guide for where to place my buttons. And to keep the buttons in place, I'm just using Scotch tape. It's actually a super effective method for keeping your buttonholes in place while you sew them on, and the needle will just go right through the tape. I'm switching right back to my regular presser foot here, and I'm just going to go to a 0 stitch length and a zigzag stitch. And I'm going to make sure that my stitch width is wide enough to go side to side through these buttonholes. The tape allows me to position the buttonhole under the presser foot before I lower the presser foot onto the buttonhole and everything starts shifting around. And I'm just going to go through and sew all the buttonholes all at once without trimming my strings. And then once I'm done, I can peel off that tape, which is really satisfying, and trim my threads. Trim the threads. Okay, there we go. And I have to say, this is a pretty nice button and buttonhole installation, folks. Now we're going to open our buttonholes. You can do this by either using a seam ripper, just kind of poke it in there and rip it open. Some sewing people are really against doing this. I actually really like to use my buttonhole chisel for this, and I've got a 12 millimeter, which is about 1/2 inch. And I have a thick rubber mat that I like to use under my chisel just so that I'm not ruining any table surfaces. And as you can see, it creates a really nice, clean opening. Now your garment is ready to be buttoned. Okay, so here's the dress finished per the original pattern instructions. And I just want to add a little bit of shaping to be more similar to the inspiration photo that I shared earlier. So what I'm going to do now is, with the dress on, I'm just going to go around and pinch around the waist to locate where I want to put these pleats. I'm pretty happy with the shaping on this so far, and now I'm just going to take this off and I'm going to transfer these to the wrong side of the fabric because we want the pleats to actually be sewn on the wrong side, not the right side. You could do this with the dress on inside out, but it's going to be easier to get the buttons undone and get it off without hurting yourself by getting stuck by pins if you do it this way, and then just kind of transfer everything over. All right. Since these were roughly pinned, I am taking the average distance of the front pleats from the center front and the average width of each of the front pleats to determine how wide to make them, because I want them to be equal and evenly spaced. And I'm doing the same thing for the back pleats, except I'm taking the measurement from the side seam. Now I have flipped the garment to the wrong side so that I can start relocating the pleats with my new measurements. And I'm just using pins here to locate the pleats and hold them in place. And I've figured out that the 4th button down from the top was a good location for my waist, so I'm using that as a guide as well. Now I am folding the garment in half, aligning the button plackets and the side seams to locate the center back. Here I'm showing to measure straight across to the center back to determine the pleat location, but I actually ended up moving the pleats up by about 2.5 inches because they were a little too low at this initial measurement. And again, I'm just using pins to mark my pleat locations and to pin them in place. Now we are ready to sew. I also used pins to mark the top and the bottom of the pleats, and I ended up making my pleats about 2 inches long. Next, I flattened the pleat fold with an iron to create the box pleat. And you can see now that that seam is perfectly centered in the pleat. Now I'm just going to tack at the top and the bottom of the pleat with a secure stitch to keep everything in place and keep the pleats from pulling apart. Now we just need to trim these threads and we are finished with this dress. Thank you so much for joining me on this first YouTube video on my channel. I'm so excited. I finally did it because I procrastinated for a really long time. I did not want to post this video at first because I was very nervous, but it's out there and I'm glad. I filmed this in the summer. It is now fall. The leaves are changing and it is very cold outside. Hopefully I gave you some ideas for how to carry the style into the fall and beyond. So yeah, thank you for being here. It means a lot to me. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe and give me a thumbs up. I've got more coming. Also, if there's something that you would like to see, be sure to leave me a comment below and let me know. Okay, I will see you in the next video. Bye. I was inspired for this to relax.